in the whole territory.
Ladies and gentlemen, the occasion today is the arrival at Fairmont Clinic for this clinical conference of one of the pioneers in medicine and group practice in West Virginia. And Dr. Ben Golden of Elkins, who has very graciously consented to come and share with us some of his experiences, in one sense needs no introduction, but in another sense a few words need to be said. He is the son of a distinguished physician who was probably the first formally trained medical doctor in northern West Virginia, who came to Elkins in 1892. And his father became a secretary of the State Medical Association, subsequently the president. These were the years in which the fights were really important for getting rid of tin cups on railroads that were spreading disease, and there were no public health associations. It took battles to achieve all kinds of things. And then his father became superintendent of Davis Memorial Hospital, and some of you remember that the two U.S. senators, we still have one living in Elkins, but two then lived in Elkins, and Dr. Golden himself was a graduate of Temple and returned to Elkins for preceptorship under his father, and subsequently became the superintendent of Davis Memorial. And upon his father's death in 1929, began the founding of Golden Clinic, named after the older Dr. Golden, which is today one of the distinguished medical groups in the country. And from that group came early concepts of prepayment and many things in connection with the coal industry. And whatever Dr. Golden cares to share, he says he's in retirement. He'll be 80 this fall. And he's doing his memoirs. Whatever he cares to share in the time he presents it, he'll also be ready to answer questions about other matters. He's known as a very blunt and outspoken and plain-spoken man, and I treat all that as a compliment in giving you Dr. Golden of Elkins, West Virginia.
Gentlemen, if you don't mind, I'll remain seated. Due to your lack of medical knowledge, I have some vascular problems in my lower extremities. If any of you have a cure, I'll remain after the meeting. I would prefer to be introduced just as a country doctor, which I have been all my life, and I'm sure you all know the definition of a country doctor. For brevity, he is a man that wears a vest, and in the left-hand pocket he has a couple of thermometers, a fountain pen. In his left-hand coat pocket he has a stethoscope. On his heels of his shoes he has a little horse manure and a case to discuss. Since I've been invited to come here and speak a little on the historical past of medicine, both locally, by that I mean state, and nationally, by that I mean encompassing the pros and cons, of which you older men know something about, and pray God you younger men will be spared. I'll try and start with, let us say, the genesis of why you're here. Your good director has done some very excellent and able writing in the presentation of the miner, who he is, what he is, and why he is. But he started in the middle of the Old Testament. I'll try and start for a moment at Genesis. If I'm wrong, any of you Bible students correct me later. Oddly enough, the state of West Virginia, probably like no other state in the Union, became habitable outside of the Conestoga wagon and others going through it, and still do from the looks of the census, was a state where towns developed at railheads. It was a state of heavy industry, primarily coal and lumber. That meant you had to move it by rail. So that when a location was found that was economically worth developing, a railhead was put in, a town was established, and then the inhabitants were brought in. Who were the inhabitants? The inhabitants were primarily from the Mediterranean portion of Europe and Asia. They were brought over in steerage to come to the great new country where the lady held up her high torch for a new thinking, to get out not of slavery in the true sense of the word, the African sense, but peonage in the dictator sense as those countries were formed. That being the case, historically, we brought in labor that came from the family unit. And his great endeavor in landing in the country of gold streets was to make enough to bring his family and feel free, to be able to do what he called freedom, not knowing what freedom was. I'm not sure we do now. So that when he went into the mines or the lumber camps, he went in to an isolated region. His only method of contact with the outside world was the occasional newspaper, the telegraph instrument, and the men who rode the rails. He was tied down. He went to work, depending on his job, at any hour of the day or night. He earned money. That's something he had not seen in the old country. This money was real money. It's backed by the United States government, that great country, that new world. And he would have some of it. Unfortunately, other factors were playing a part. He got 8 cents a ton for his coal. I think that's what was paid when I worked in the mines in 1913. Don't misunderstand me, I was playing ball on the side. I didn't work very hard. My biggest problem was to go out and find carloads of post holes. He was earning this money. Of course, he didn't get paid for the rock. He only got paid for the coal. And he got paid every 2 weeks. And he would go to the company office to collect his pay. And at the company office, he would be given a group of slips called chits, because these were money. These were what he bought food with. he would come to the office between paydays and ask for a couple of dollars to go to the company store and purchase his food, and he would be given a chit. It was always careful that he always owed the company about 50 or 75 cents each payday. He rarely saw the color of this United States money. He was always in debt. If he got ahead a little bit, there was one of his comrades who had come over a little bit smarter, and he was the man who knew how to make out the money orders to send money back to the family. And he did this. He was a great friend. All he asked was anywhere from 10 to 30% for making out the money order to send back to the family. We can't call this slavery. We'll call it isolationism, for a better word. Those of you who are interested in historical facts will go back to about 1923 or 24 when H.L. Mencken wrote a most astonishing and illuminating article on the company store. Many times the coal was not the profit. The company store was, because that's the only place he could buy. And no competition could come in because the chit would not be recognized by a private store. So he had to go to the company store. So that what is a miner and why is he isolated and why does he live a peculiar life as written by this young man, I think is better explained by the etiology of his being a miner, as it was in being a transcontinental railroad worker, except that when the railroad was through, he drifted into a town and became a human being and a person, sometimes a politician, sometimes a businessman. He grew. This was not permitted of the miner. He was always subjugated to the whim and will of the job which was created by an act of God in the minerals that were taken out for the profits of the non-resident people. In the late teens and early 20s, the union came along. The union, like any other new process of democracy, of life, was a sprawling centipede with many feet and not really knowing where it was going, and created within itself problems that unfortunately added to the problem of the miner, innocently on his part. Just shortly before I came, there were machine guns on the hillsides. And I remember having been maybe here a month, 2 months, when the superintendent of the mines brought in a man. He said, "I want your help, Ben." And I said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "I want you to put a bandage around his head and put a little red ink on it. I want to show that he was hit in a fight." Innocently, I did what he asked to do. I didn't help any situation except to make it worse. These were things that brought about the camps, and I use the word camps or mine towns, if you will, because the town was built by the owner of the mines, rented to the miner. He paid $2 a month for his electricity, which was turned off at 10 o'clock at night. He could leave it on all day, and he did, because it was too much trouble to turn off. He still paid $2 a month. That was modern. He had electricity. That didn't bother the company any because they had a surplus of power. This didn't cost them anything, really. And they rented the house, which was unbelievable. I don't know whether any of them are really standing today that haven't had some support given to them, a couple of crutches or something to keep them up. But they lived fairly well. And when I was in Italy and some of the other southern countries and saw some of these little towns where these people came from and tried to visualize 50, 75 years back, I guess they were living well, comparatively speaking. But at all times, they were under the yoke. They were never themselves. I remember 1914 being up in the office on a payday when a big Polish man came in for his money. I guess he was 6'6". Later, to me, he became 12 feet. Between me and the aisle he could walk through to collect was a steel grating, which we were told below the counter level was lead, and there were 2 pistols under there, just for safety. And I told him he had no money coming. We were just on the edge then of World War I. The aisle was probably a little wider than this table. He stepped back against the wall and he made one leap and came to the top of that iron grating, which was about 12 feet, white, trembling, grabbed it, and I thought the grating was going to come down. And he came down, war coming, lots of people killed. By God, maybe we get a penny. This is to illustrate the mentality which was not on the surface, but which was brewing underneath and made unionism possible. But unfortunately, as in everything else, something good always has something corrupt. And then we had inter-union, company, company union, etc. So I've tried to bring you up to date as to why the miner thought he was isolated. He was. Why he thought he was of a different breed than the people in town. He never saw people in town. He had no way to get to town, with rare exceptions. In 1918, I think, President Wilson sent Alonzo Taylor, professor of pharmacology at the University of Pennsylvania, up to Shamokin and some of the anthracite areas to see whether or not he could report back a method or suggestion to which the government might establish a setup, and I use that for the want of a better word, a bureau it'll be today, to teach the miner that he was earning good money now and to try and save some of it. I knew Dr. Taylor. His report to President Wilson was, "You can't do that. These people are starving, not in the sense of food, but in the sense of life. And if they have an extra dollar, the first thing they want is a big red lamp in their parlor. It makes them feel that they're prosperous. And then after they get the red lamp, they want to buy a piano, even though nobody can play it. So they're not going to save money, and there's no use in you trying." This was a report to the President of the United States in 1918 in trying to help and correct the miners' situation. What I've done up to this moment, as I said in the beginning, is to try and give you a genesis of which I have not seen in your reports and the psychologists and the other ivory towered group, of which I'm not one, so I can speak loudly. Then came another change, which was fundamental, but brought about by necessity. And that was health. At this period that I've just talked about, the curse of the camp was the spring thaw and typhoid fever. Usually, anywhere from 40 to 60% of the camp went out with typhoid fever. Either went out in death, or as they used to call it, walking typhoid, which meant that the man wasn't sick enough to go to bed or too damn mean to go to bed, but he wasn't well enough to do anything else. And he was off. He occupied a house. They couldn't evict him. He was still employed, although there were no laws to say so. And he was a burden. Medicine at that time was not economically profitable in the true sense of the word as it is today, or maybe I'm wrong. It's questionable. So there were many doctors who had their degrees. This was prior to Rockefeller's Flexner, Abram Flexner.
Yeah, 1910.
Huh?
1910.
Yeah, this is prior to Flexner's looking over and talking about what a medical school should be. These men had diplomas. I wouldn't say they were diploma mill graduates. That would not be fair. They were sincere. They wanted to learn something of medicine, if nothing more than taking pulse and giving a prescription of some kind and living a little better than their neighbor. I'll cite you a little instance back from my father's time, if I may. I think most of us are always interested in some of the human things that happen. When Dad came to Elkins, unknowing to himself, he brought a fever thermometer. It didn't occur to him that everybody wouldn't have a fever thermometer. He was a Bellevue graduate, and in New York City, the doctors had a fever thermometer. He quickly learned that he couldn't trust the oral taking of temperature. He just sat there, as he always said, ready to grab that thermometer before the teeth did. So he went to axillary temperatures. He was called out in the country to see an elderly lady who was supposed to be desperately ill. He went in and examined her. Got up and left the room, invited the family out to tell them what he found. And he'd no more than gotten out the door of her bedroom, and she started to scream. Dad said he turned around quickly, and here was this poor soul screaming and tears coming down, torrents. She was really beside herself. And he wondered what he had done. When he left her seconds before, she was all right. He went back to the bedside. And he finally got her calmed down enough to ask her, "What did I do? What happened?" "Oh," she said, "I'm going to die. You're going to tell the family I'm going to die." He said, "No, I'm not. You're going to get well. You're going to be all right. Don't get upset. Don't worry." "Yes, but you didn't use that machine on me, and if you didn't do it, you knew I was going to die." That was the thermometer. I might say that Dad used to say that no man could be a doctor unless he was also a psychiatrist. That was the days before we used the word psychiatry as we use it today. One of the first things he did was to find that in taking care of the patients, who were mostly miners, of course, or lumber people. The lumber people were usually Americans. They went into the woods. The foreigners went underground. Was to learn their language sufficiently to take a history. And consequently, he became very endeared to them. And I remember as a boy, I never could understand why, when they passed our house, lots of them would raise their hat. And I later learned it was in reverence, because he thought of them and their plight. Now we jump for a moment, if I will, not to tire you, and when you're getting tired, somebody raise your hand for either purpose. My father was a giant of a student. I was no match for him. In fact, I didn't belong to the same family. I think the greatest compliment he ever had, at least he felt so. And if your mind will go back a moment to what I'm going to say, you'll appreciate it. He spoke before a medical group in Baltimore, and William Osler introduced him. And his introduction was, "I'm introducing to you the only man I know that can go from the bedside of a typhoid to the operating table of acute appendicitis and do justice to both." I'd like for that kind of a compliment to be made of me someday. He died in 1929. Most of you know little about that period. That was the post-war period in which each day millions were made and paupers were made. But a little like the miner, nobody ever saw the dollar. It was all on paper. He died on October 14th, 1929. Black Friday was October the 29th, 1929. So I had about 10 to 12 days of normal life. The only normal life I guess I've had in all of my medical practice, which was 50 years last June. Now, what I'm taking is nitroglycerin, but it's not for coronary. I'm not going to do what Mr. Hoover just did. Don't excite it. I have an abnormality here that does an angina every now and then. And finally, somebody suggested that I use this, and it works part of the time. The day my father died, the road between Baltimore and Elkins was open to allow my sister and her husband, who is an associate professor of medicine at Hopkins and the recent author of a book on internal medicine, some of you may know him, Dr. Paulson, to come through on hard-surfaced roads. Elkins became 5 hours and a half from Baltimore, the great medical center. Anytime you wanted to go, instead of twice a day, 12 hours. So I was faced with a dilemma. Did I stay or did I go back? And through some error of memory, I was still acceptable in Philadelphia. And I decided to stay. But to stay meant a complete change in the attitude. Medicine may be traced from the Greeks down in periods, but I think modern medicine can be traced to Belleau Woods, to the trenches of France and Germany, to the use of the needle instead of the rectal tube for feeding. A transformation, if you will, the knowledge of Ringer's solution, the value of saline to the human body, all came about almost instantly with the armistice. And strides of medicine as a science and not as an empirical design on the human body had to be dealt with. The future was written. We had radium had come in. We were seeing the destruction of the immature cell by radiation. The Coolidge tube had come in, which meant that you weren't going to get killed when you measured the spark gap of the old static machine and took 5 minutes to x-ray a hand. The film had come in, so we didn't have to worry with glass plates. We began to do a little more than a urinalysis and a blood count, which was extremely limited to white and red cells, and a piece of paper for hemoglobin, which you matched. So faced with this, and the quandary, what do I do now? Stay here among my people, where I'm having a good time practicing medicine, or go fight red and green lights and hospital politics? I say that kindly, but I happen to know something about it, because while I was still a resident, the board sent me to New York to study hospitalization in lying-in hospital, Sinai Hospital, and hip joint disease. And then it was my pleasure to work with John G. Clark, Frank Hammond, Pollock, and others when radium first came to America. I brought the first radium to West Virginia. So I began to see a little of scientific medicine. And I was getting a little too old to pitch baseball anymore. And the contract I had from the Pittsburgh Pirates had run out. So I better settle down. Now, how do I settle down? What do I do? Well, we had 10 or 12 doctors in Elkins. We had this hospital, and then we had another hospital. Of course, a hospital in those days was a building on which there was a sign, hospital. And that was all that was necessary. Accreditation was coming in 20s, but it was having a hard time and it didn't know what it wanted. The AHA was just being formulated, and the AMA didn't want that, and Morris Fishbein was beginning to crow. You all don't know who he was. That's a shame. You didn't miss anything. So I decided that I wasn't a student. I knew I wasn't. In my freshman or sophomore vacation, the last I had, from that day on I have spent in a hospital entirely. I took care of the great Horatio Wood. Now, unless you're a historian, you don't know who he was. But he's the father of the United States Pharmacopoeia. The finding of atropine and its opposite, some of the other drugs. He was more or less bedridden. And he was out in a little suburban community outside of Philadelphia. And on this hot July day, the screen door didn't fit very well, and I took it off and was sawing. He rang his bell, and I went in, and he said, got a carpenter here? I said, no. Why? He said, who's sawing that door? I said, I am. Good, good. You better be a surgeon. You don't have brains to be an internist. So I had it mapped out for me. And there I was, just on the brink of the heyday of finances in this United States, and the catastrophe and the downpour. I sought from the local physicians to try and get them together and see if we couldn't divide our labors into a little more specific types. God forbid I didn't want them to be specialists, and I didn't want to be a specialist. Not sure I still want to be. But they weren't interested. My father had had that problem, so I knew that if he couldn't do it, I couldn't do it. He was better at that than I was. So I sought a young man, local boy who finished his medicine, was interested in medicine. He came with me. We didn't know where the dollars were coming from. By that time, we'd had October 29th. More doctors were running streetcars than they were writing prescriptions. And we started to form a little group. I'd been to the Mayos. I'd been dazzled. I'd heard how they treat acute appendicitis, which they average 6 a year, but they could write papers on them. How they removed kidneys with x-rays that even a Brownie camera could do better. Still, we had to take our hat off to them. They were doing something. They were paving a way. They were pioneers, and like all pioneers, they could be criticized. but also they could be respected. So I tried to see if I could get a few doctors who might be interested in having the fun of practicing medicine. All you did was come to the hospital in the morning, you had a little office, you put on an operating suit because we didn't know what air conditioning was, but you were comfortable. You took it off at 5 o'clock or 6 whenever you were through. You went home. But you could study. You could have a lot of fun. You might steal a dog off the street once in a while if you were so interested. See whether your sutures were too tight or too loose. Whether you could bring them back from ether. And don't ever try to give ether to a cat or you won't bring it back. And then we began to have patients. The patients came in from everywhere. But they didn't know whether they had a hole in their pocket or not because they had nothing to put in their pocket. But we were trying to hold on to a payroll. Back in 1922, 23, the checkoff came to northern West Virginia. It had been the southern end of the state. I said to you earlier, my talk, I think, that the company was glad to put in a doctor to get the men back to work. They also were glad because by that time there was a compensation law in the state. If a man got hurt, they had to pay if he got hurt on the job. Of course, you had to figure out where the job was. Was the job 2 miles underground at 2 o'clock or at 2:05? Was he supposed to be at work or was he at lunch? Oddly enough, and this will interest you all who are doing traumatic surgery, whenever I got an injury on the 1st of February, I knew he was going to be crippled for 3 months. It didn't make a darn bit of difference what he had because the contract came up on April 1st. And he was on pension, compensation. So he wasn't going back to work. We had a lot of fun with that. By 1936, we had a 12-man group. A group of specialists, well-trained men. I was proud of them. I've always been proud of the staff. We thought we were going somewhere. We were coming out of the Depression. Our checks were coming through sometimes, maybe a month late. We were able, all through that, to never reduce the salaries of a hospital employee or be late, even though we mortgaged our homes to do it. We prided ourselves, and for that we got loyalty, believe me. In 1937, by the good fortune of having good legal advice I inherited from my father, we got together and decided to really form some type of a close-knit group practice. Still trying to find out what is group practice. And if any of you have a definition today, I'm sure the group practice would be glad to have it because they don't know how to qualify the yardstick now for the future of medicine. We wrote up the articles of the practice, which meant that all participants in the group, MDs of course, and one dentist, would participate in all scientific problems. We all would draw the same salary. If there was a little more and we could raise the salary, we all got the raise. Nobody was different from anybody else. For the benefit, if there's a radiologist or pathologist in the group, if he will look at that date and time, he will find that he usually was just this side of the outhouse. He was no real person in the necessity of good medicine. It was just an adornment. I remember Toby Weinberg, recently died, pathologist at Sinai in Baltimore, saying to me, "Gosh, this is the first place I know of that's ever recognized a pathologist as being a doctor." We drew up these articles. We were very proud of them. We sent them to the AMA legal department for their blessing and suggestions. That was a mistake. Never done it since. They wrote back and said it was idealistic. We hoped it would work and wished us Godspeed. And that was the prayer of happiness I got from the AMA in helping us. Then the war broke out. I might go back to the CCC, the civilian camps, for a moment, which Roosevelt put in, and for which we had about 100,000 boys stretched out through our neighboring counties, and for which we did their service. This is an interesting thing. You'll like it. We had 2 hospitals in the town, the Davis Memorial, which was a memorial, non-taxable, owned by no one, didn't even have a board till 1936, didn't have any certificate from the state to have a hospital. Senator Davis, Senator Elkins didn't need those things. They're like some of our modern politicians. So that when the camps came and they were put in charge of the Army Medical Department, the first thing I knew was the city hospital, and I say this in deference, please, was merely a wooden building built of second-hand lumber in which the chief surgeon and owner, it was a proprietary thing, had made this statement at the County Medical Society some years earlier. The only thing you need to do with these check-off patients, and he had several hundred of them, primarily in lumber, put them to bed, give them some aspirin, clean sheet, and something to eat, and they'll get well. Don't worry about them. And that was our competition. But as soon as I learned this, I went to Washington to see the Surgeon General. You know, you have to be naive sometimes. They would be mistakes, but because you're naive and people look at you in Washington and say, "How dumb can you be?" They open the door. They did. Well, the upshot was we were the non-profit hospital. Therefore, it was tax-supported, and therefore, by law, they had to give me the patients. They had no out. Incidentally, I one time went up to this lawyer that I'm talking about. I used to have to go up to him about every other day. I never knew there were so many legal problems. And I said to him on this day, "EA, I come up here every day at noon when I get the mail." I carried the mail in those days, sometimes a bedpan, and I could upset it like any good nurse. And I'd like to have a book or something on just ordinary law, so I won't be bothering you. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. Finally, I said, "Damn it, did you hear what I said?" He said, "Yes." Well, I said, "Answer me. He said, Ben, I'm trying to. I'm just trying to remember the name of that book Mrs. Bowers got yesterday, Home Remedies, so you don't need to call a doctor. That taught me a lesson. So by 38, we felt we had organized a group. I had been to Mayo Clinic. Fortunately, I knew some of the men there. Frank Cruzen, the father of modern physiotherapy, was there. We were like brothers, and others. I'd been to Wheeling, where the Wheeling Clinic was being set up by the late Dr. Fulton, who didn't have to worry too much about the dollar because his wife owned 51% of Wheeling Steel. The only thing my wife owned was the mortgage that I took when I took her. And I'd been to other places, and I decided this was one time you paddle your own canoe. The only thing is that somebody builds the canoe, and somebody was building this kind of medicine. And the great Morris Fishbein was coming out and blossoming. The great kingmakers of the AMA were not going to see group practice or anything else come in and rob them of being secretary and treasurer. You know, Pendergrast, there's the American College of Surgeons, the North American Society of Radiology, of which I'm a member, and 3 or 4 others. Pendergrast of Philadelphia. He's the fellow with the chest, yeah.
Yeah, you got it. We know about Mr. Black.
Had a little sense of humor, if you knew him. And he was elected president of one of them, I don't remember which. And his first presidential article, he came out and he said, I had hoped we could get all of these organizations together under one roof for better scientific advancement. But I find that if we do, we'll lose 3 or 4 presidents, 4 or 5 vice presidents, and a half a dozen secretary and treasurers, and I guess God don't want it to work that way. So it never has. The war broke out. They took 5 of our men immediately, and then my good and dear friend, John L. Lewis, put a stop to that. So that left us 7, with 200,000 troops coming in for training. And because of a typographical error, they thought my father was still alive, who had played an active part in World War I in the medical group, was responsible for the opening of Fort Meade. They put me in supervisory charge as a layman over the troops. Now, I hope none of you, unless you become President of the United States, ever have to sit and lay clothes in civvies and talk to a captain or a lieutenant, because it don't go well. But we fought that through. They built a station hospital for me across the street from the hospital. And the 7 of us, which later became 6, one of the boys got interested in the neck of a bottle. He wanted to see the bottom. We couldn't tolerate that. Until 46. And then it was decided by that board which I created that they wanted the hospital to themselves. Of course, they didn't need to underwrite the mortgage anymore. Banknotes. So we moved out. And we really went into the business of operating a hospital and a clinic. The first question asked by some of you will be, do you think a clinic should run a hospital? The answer is yes and no. At a meeting of the college, American College of Surgeons in Baltimore, I severely criticized the Accreditation Commission, who sent a notice Dr. Joe Smith will be in your hospital on the 10th at 2 p.m. to review your hospital. Any damn fool can get the charts out and see that they're up to date, and if he can't approve that, you're never going to get anywhere. So that was accreditation. There was a pathologist by accident got employed over at Kaiser. He came in to see me one day and he said, "You know, I never knew there were so many normal ovaries outside of a human body in all my life as I'm seeing now. Do you all have any pathology?" At that meeting, I suggested that if we're going to have accreditation, let's have it based on something substantial. Don't notify the hospital when you're coming, first, and second, don't send somebody down who can't make a living some other way or wants to semi-retire or just enjoys travel to see the world. Let's have a good, substantial setup, and the first would be a pathological review board. George Cryle, the late George Cryle, to whom I have a tremendous respect for, one of our real scientists in medicine, was on the platform, and I was about 3 feet away from him, and he had the morning paper in his hand. And when I came up with that, he came across the top of my head and he says, "What in the hell do you want to do to this organization?" So my desire to see scientific, instigated bureaus put into action for calibration of medicine flunked at that moment. Since then, you have your tissue committee, of which I feel I had something to do with, even if it was only a slap over the head. '46, as I said, we went out and bought a hotel. We had the great sum of $40,000 in our treasure. And within 2 days, we owed $295,000. I hope God lets me live long enough that I don't owe somebody. I carry a credit card, but I don't know why they let me have it. But we were on our way towards building a group. What constitutes a group? Now we'll change the subject from the preliminaries to what you all sitting here are interested in. I'll briefly describe up to a point and then I'll stop and I'll let you all try and make me the target. To me, there are 3 kinds of groups. One is the proprietary, owned by someone or some 2 or 3. Maybe owned honestly for the purpose of good medicine, maybe owned so they can play golf on Wednesday and Saturday, maybe owned because they just like the idea, and all connected on the staff are full-time employees. Unlike my 36 and 37 experience, when the men around me did not know that tomorrow morning I may give them a pink slip, and therefore they could not be loyal, or they weren't worth anything if they were loyal and couldn't see ahead in the future. So you have the proprietary clinic. They're good and bad. We'll go into that in a moment. Then you have the second group, in which the old established members are the heavy owners of the stock. The younger men come in and obtain stock, and therefore participation to a limited extent. But their stock is minor. The promises are great. After 3 years, you become a partner, and you look around and find there's no doctor here over 3 years. It may make for good medicine. It may make for indifferent medicine. Now, in all of this description, I'm talking about human beings. So let's don't talk about the idealist. We may have never another Hoover. I doubt it. They're only one of a kind. They crucified one. But the medicine is usually of a pretty high type, because these younger men are activated by the knowledge that they can become a part and parcel of the organization. But they're usually separated for X period of time in management, advancing of ideas, related of development of departments, etc. So they are better off than the full-time in a proprietary group than they were if they weren't in that group. The third group is that one in which there is a financial involvement, where the individual comes in. He may have to put in a certain amount of money to start with, or maybe from his earnings an investment is made. He has a basic income. He is told, and truthfully so, that basic income is derived from the living costs of the community, from what experience has shown the department does. And then he becomes a participant in the profits. The profits being that monies when all else is paid for and maintenance is obtained. Without meaning to quote, but I will, because what I'm going to quote is a successful such group. But the success was based on the tremendous reputation